And I am really pleased today to welcome to our panel discussion Danny Ray from Nepean Building Permits, Brent Williams from BWNA National Building Consultants. We also have Peter Jolly, who is the MBS at the City of Hume, but also the president of the VMBSG. And we've got a couple of representatives from the architect profession as well. Bill Karatis, who's the president of the Australian Institute of Architects, and Anthony Apollini, who's from Architectus. And David Brockman is also hanging around to participate in the panel discussion. So a year on, or a bit more than a year on from introducing the Code of Conduct, I think when I've spoken to most building surveyors and said, what has that meant for you? They've said, no, nothing. We already did it all really well. We haven't really seen a change. But when we dig a little bit deeper, not necessarily with individuals, but, hearing across the industry what's gone on, there has been some quite significant shifts, I'd say, from the Code of Conduct. So we saw master builders actually stop issuing building permits, their permit function, which had been in place for some years, and they're now winding that down. We also know that there are more building surveyors choosing to take on the role as building consultants and participate in the design phase rather than being appointed the RBS. In some cases, we've heard of firms that have moved exclusively to the consultancy role, others that say that they wouldn't do the consultancy role and only want to continue to practice as RBS. And of course, there are some that are still navigating that tricky fence of doing both, which is a challenge, and where you do need to be then careful as to your role on individual projects and how your services are promoted to others. So we're going to talk to the panel today about a number of those issues. And whilst I start with the first question to our panellists, could I have the poll put up, please, for our audience to have a look at whilst we're commencing the discussion? And this polling question asks you to select from a number of options there of any potential changes you've made to your business as a result of the introduction of the code. So have a good read through all of those options, and you can select as many that might apply to you. In the meantime, I'm going to ask my first question to Brent. And I'd like some opening comments from you, Brent, on what changes you've made or what observations you have of your fellow practitioners or even the other stakeholders that you deal with in terms of the Code of Conduct. And if you could give us some opening comments.
Sure. The Code of Conduct obviously has been in for a few years. It's not a bad document. It sort of just straightens people up, I guess, into doing the right thing. When we talk about managing complaints and dealing with complaints, I was taught to do that as a very young cadet in 1980s, early days. The best way of solving problems is to deal with them straight away. In our business, we've introduced ISO 9001, which is a quality assurance system, and that basically encompasses all of the requirements of the code. So we're dealing with it quite well straight up. So, yeah.
Thanks, Brent. Danny, some opening comments from you on the code and what it has meant for you and what you see for the profession.
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. Thanks for having us on the panel. Good to see everyone. Same for us, really the same as with Brent. First impressions were that we were pretty close to the mark with how we'd been operating. Certainly straightened us up. Kind of when you read it, it feels like you're a grade 5 in front of your teacher and you're going to get the whip if you talk out of school. So for us, it's just helped to really reinforce the minimum standards that we all try to achieve. Certainly around consultancy, and I'm going to try and speak from perhaps a grassroots approach to building surveying, which is really out of suburbs of Melbourne, regional areas of Victoria. They're day-to-day things that we face all the time, and consultancy is an interesting one because there's a lot of things that designers just don't know, and introduction of bushfire, complex planning controls. Building surveyors end up becoming a very common person that's approached by the design fraternity for help just to get started. And we really pretty much have to stay out of that now. As much as we all try to help get people on track, we just have to remove ourselves from being involved in those areas. So certainly stopped any real sort of form of consultancy. We've also focused very heavily on not being involved prior to appointment, and only regulatory responses to questions. Similar to everyone with complaints management, just try to get everything in writing and try to focus heavily on responding in writing and being respectful to the public on any matters that arise. And it seems to work fine. Conflict of interest is an interesting one for me, and I've got some comments that will come on that. But we take the conservative approach to conflict. If it's potentially a conflict, we just don't go there. So that's how we've gone from the code of conduct. But I also believe that building surveying is about integrity. It's upholding the regulations, it's protecting the community, and I think that to a certain extent, when you adopt those policies, sometimes I'm wondering whether the conflict of interest has just gone a little bit too far in its restrictions. The code of conduct covers all those other areas.
Thanks, Danny. We will have a bit more of a discussion around the code of conduct controls in there. Peter Jolly, could you make some comments about observations either from within council or what you see as the MBS looking out? And you may want to comment on the poll results if you can see them there too that have come through in terms of what our audience says about changes.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Hello all. To be honest, in local government, and I have discussed this with the executive of the VMBSG recently, because we knew that this session was coming up, we haven't noticed it in any overt sense to be in local government. It doesn't get cited in local government operations all that much. What's happening out in the private sector, it probably hasn't been clear to us as to whether or not it's having any effect that might be changing behaviours in any great way. That doesn't mean it's not. It's just that we don't necessarily interact with the private sector in that fashion, or get an understanding of whether or not private building surveyors are actually factoring it into the way they operate their businesses. We all see building surveying practices that are very good and some that are not so good. That's, I suppose, consistent with the profession as a whole and the building professions as a whole. There's a whole diversity of practice behaviours and attitudes out there. So what I can say is that the VMBSG does think that the Code of Practice is an excellent document, and it needs to be encouraged and promoted. Some of the observations of our members that have been put to me are that it hasn't been promoted by the VBA in local government in any manner that has resulted in it percolating into council laws and council management. And so there's not a high deal of, in fact, there's zero awareness of the Code of Conduct and what obligations building surveyors working in local government have. And as a result of that, I was speaking to a building surveyor only in the last week or so who was telling me that senior management people tell him how to carry out his functions, and that he's reluctant to not do as he's told. And when the Code of Conduct came up, as in terms of there's a risk in allowing that to happen, the response was, well, management don't know or care about the Code of Conduct, and I've got to look after my job, don't I? So there is that work to be done, I think. The VBA need to do a lot of work to engage with local government in particular. It's quite a gap in the system that we believe at the VMBSG needs to be closed.
Okay.
So they're my thoughts off the
Thanks,
off
Peter.
the cuff.
Thanks, Peter. And there's no doubt that the MBS role is quite different to the PBS role in terms of who the masters are. And, yesterday we touched on the municipal building control plans and some of that work which might help to elevate the importance of the building departments in councils. Just looking at the poll results there, the major one, or the most frequently responded, that one of the things that you've changed is making a clear distinction between the services My Business's offices as a building consultant and those as the relevant building surveyor. So let's move to that topic. I'm not really surprised at that, because this is the whole issue around involvement in design. I'd like to bring in our architect representatives here. Anthony, can you tell us what is the impact of the code been on architects, and have you seen an increase in understanding about this distinction that has to be drawn for the role of building surveyor and the use of consultant building surveyors on the types of projects that you work on?
Thank you, Bronwyn, and hello, everyone. My view on this is that as it relates to my own observations within a relatively large national office, is that the uptake has been relatively gradual, and a degree of uncertainty is still very prevalent. I've got a couple of theories behind why that may be. But to sort of mitigate this early on, my own office initiated seminars hosted by a building surveying practice we often use, who introduced our staff to the code of practice changes and how they will impact the way we perform our services. Attendance was pretty good, but it didn't capture everybody, and it had to be done online due to COVID. Personally, I believe that this was fine as an introduction, but in terms of having the message broadly sink in, seminars such as those we conducted probably have only a fairly peripheral effect, particularly with things like properly understanding demarcation between what is and what is not design advice. I think direct experience within the code's actual impact through the design and documentation phases of projects and how its requirements are interpreted by and applied by both the consultant and relevant building surveyors will necessarily be the most effective means of bringing our profession up to speed. Some unknown implications are bound to be forthcoming with time, I expect. So there will likely be an evolutionary aspect to it as well in terms of that uptake. My view also is that for the architectural profession and the relationship we have with building surveyors in future, it remains all about getting the right compliance advice as early as we can so that a board of design work is minimised or avoided altogether. And having that demarcation clearly defined in the most unambiguous way possible is probably one of the key challenges going forward. And to be honest, I think that that kind of clarity at least is going to take a while to permeate through our profession and those other disciplines we typically work closely with.
Okay, could I ask for the next poll question to be put up? And while that poll's sitting there, Brent, can you tell us what your approach is to this whole issue of not participating in design and how you go about giving advice on compliance? You need to unmute. Thanks, Brent.
So, yeah, we certainly give our building code compliance advice every day of the week. That's what we do as building surveyors. We know the book pretty much inside and out. And as Danny has said, that we're the go-to for a lot of the complex regulations. As being part of the design meetings or design teams, we'll go to those meetings, and that terminology, design meeting or design team, probably needs to change, because I'll go to those and I'll give building code advice, but I certainly don't put pen to paper and start to tell people what they should and shouldn't do. I can certainly identify areas that won't meet the deemed to satisfy provisions, and then suggest you need to look at speaking to somebody who's appropriately qualified to prepare a performance solution. So that's how we run our business, and we find that quite good. The role as a consultant building surveyor, certainly there would be a role for somebody, but it'll be only a very small amount of projects, I would imagine, across the state. For more your high-rise, your inner city type sort of work, I would think But your everyday bread and butter out of metropolitan areas and regional areas, consultant building surveyor I wouldn't think would be really required.
Yeah, Danny, you can probably confirm that, given your practice is out down the Mornington Peninsula. There'll be less consultant building surveyors on the sorts of projects that you routinely do. What's been your approach to participation in design in light of the code?
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. The same. The problem we've got is there's just not enough building surveyors around to act as consultants. So most building surveyors who are trading, certainly in regional Victoria, are issuing building permits. So there's just, and there's not enough of those as it is. So the pressure is strong, the work is high. So getting onto the consultancy side just chews up more time and takes away from issuing permits. What we've tended to find is through what we see in documentation really over the last 20 years, I suppose, is just a very steady decline in quality. And this is again at grassroots level. And I think people in regional Victoria will certainly relate to this, that the drafts people are struggling. They struggle with planning, they struggle with res code. They have lack of BCA knowledge, struggle to get consultancy with design documentation across the board with other designers, engineers and so forth. We're just seeing a general steady decline in quality, and that just puts added pressure on the building surveyor. There's no consultant building surveyor there to back it up. There's really no other person that does the work that the building surveyor does. So while we act as relevant building surveyors, we only provide regulatory advice. The reality of it is we're just trying to get these guys to understand that they need to take some responsibility to get the documentation up to speed. But in regional Victoria, there's not a lot of choices. It really is just getting as minimum as you can to get a permit, and building surveyors are facing that every day.
Yeah. Could I get a comment from either Bill or Anthony on that? Acknowledging that in some cases we're not necessarily talking about architects preparing this material, but, how does your profession respond to these issues that have arisen and these concerns around quality of documentation and NCC compliance knowledge by designers?
Yeah, thank you, Danny. Thank you, Bronwyn. Just in response to Danny's comments around the quality of documentation in regional, I can't comment whether they are in fact architects. Certainly from the Institute's perspective, via our small, medium and large practice forums, and also all the feedback we're getting from our members, is that there's a steadily increasing quality that's required. Some of the issues around lack of standards in documentation in the past may be linked to broader issues in the industry, particularly around procurement models and sort of the demands of actually wanting to get somewhere quicker via developers or contractors. So that could be related to that, but I certainly, that's not to our knowledge that there is a drop in standards in regional areas that you're describing, Danny. But from our end, we're seeing the requirement for a consultant building surveyor to be retained, and that's not just for large complex projects, but and then having the relevant building surveyor come in at an appropriate time. So ideally, from the Institute's perspective, we're seeing in this time of building reform that consultancy teams should be working together in a coordinated and calibrated method. And it's just this issue of many hands on a model, on a digital model. We'd like to bring in the consultant building surveyor at that point, and that can apply to medium scale to large scale projects. And then obviously the RBS will in turn adopt a read-only model at a point in time that is appropriate, so that they're absolutely independent to review that. But it is where we are in the industry. The digital model, which is a common platform, and particularly if it's about Revit and Autodesk BIM 360 cloud-based construction management platforms, everyone has to be on the same page, because it extends all the way through to the sub-consultants, to the subcontractors, to their shop drawers. It's just part of that whole process. So we see an ongoing role, and ideally an increase in scope, increase in fees, pushing our clients to actually take on board the consultant building surveyor early and being part of a team. And then at a point they drop off, you then bring in the independent and they take over with the model as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. And as you say, that's going to be on some of the larger projects. Some of the smaller ones probably will have a different model there. Just looking at the polling results here, it seems as though 7% of you no longer attend design meetings. 72% will still go, but you're more mindful about the comments that you're making. And then there's a 16% there that are no longer giving design advice before being appointed as the RBS. So some pretty positive results there in terms of the shift towards understanding that distinction and the need for independence from design. And I'm sure that this is an evolution. In the next topic I wanted to go to was code of conduct. Danny, you mentioned it already. And we one of the sort of feelings I get from the comments you made about the tone of the code, I've spoken to other surveyors who've said that they feel as though when they've read the code that they somehow were behaving unethically if they were offering a full range of services, including more consultancy services, when that was the business model. And so they're in some ways a bit, I guess, offended by the code and by some sort of suggestion that they were acting inappropriately when no one told them they couldn't do it that way. Is that your sort of feeling, or what are your thoughts on the conflict of interest controls and those elements of the code?
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. It's an interesting topic. I suppose most building surveyors that I talk to, where life is, it's what we know, it's what we do. We're proud and we're passionate about the role that we play. And that's why I talk about integrity, about intent to comply, and about protection of the community. In most cases, those three pillars is what building surveyor stands for. And that's the difference between, in a lot of cases, buildings complying and not complying, because ultimately it's driven by what the building surveyor does. So with conflict of interest, I've given it a bit of thought, and I've certainly talked to a few other people to get their opinions as well. The way I read when I look at the conflict of interest, I sort of read it as being a little bit of a lack of trust and faith in what the building surveyor does. As building surveyors, we believe that if we're not so much an employee, obviously we can't do work for employees, but if the employee's family comes to us and wants assistance with a building permit, at this stage we're saying we can't do that. However, we strongly believe in what we do and how we do it, and we want to make sure that the best result is achieved for that person, yet it's deemed that we're conflicted and can't carry out our functions. In thinking about what conflict means to me, I would just about argue that as soon as we're appointed as building surveyors, we're conflicted. Our intent is to issue permits as soon as we can. We want the buildings to comply. We want to be able to move on to the next job, and that's just natural run-of-the-mill of a private building company and how private companies work. We just wish the documents complied 100% and our job was easy and we could just keep flowing through the workload, but it doesn't work like that. So to me, it's about integrity. We don't issue the permits until it complies, and I would, 99% of the building surveyors out there who are issuing permits take that same philosophy and intent to how they approach those building permits and won't let them out the door until they comply. So it's a highly stressful, high workload industry at the moment. There's not many building surveyors issuing permits throughout Victoria. So it does feel a little bit like we're being attacked. But I also think that it's perhaps there is a lot of people actually doing the right thing. So other areas of conflict can also, a building surveyor issues a permit for a builder that does say 500 permits. How can they not be conflicted? So I think that conflict of interest is a bit wide-ranging, and I think it perhaps can be toned down. The Code of Conduct talks about our professional responsibilities and what we have to do. We're governed by strong control, and our paperwork will show how good or how bad we are as building surveyors. So to me, I think there's enough there, and I think there's the conflict side of it can perhaps just be reduced a little bit.
Brent, do you have a comment on that?
Look, Ginny, I'll just concur everything Danny has said. Exactly. In our office, we sort of look at it and say if we think there's a conflict, there possibly is a conflict. So we won't touch a job if it's for a staff member's family or that sort of thing, or we'll steer away from that. But when it comes to conflict, I've grown up in a regional area, and one day you're issuing a building permit for a builder, the next day you're playing footy with him at the footy club and having a beer with him that night. So, how far do you go when we talk about conflict of interest? But yeah, concur with everything Danny said. Thanks, Bronwyn.
Peter, did you want to make a comment on that topic?
It's interesting what Danny was talking about and Brent, but and this is an area of passion for me. There is a critical shortage of building surveyors in Victoria. The workloads for building surveyors are extraordinary. They're being asked to do far too much. There aren't enough building surveyors to have a separation between the advisory role and the statutory role, and it's in my view the number one issue that must be addressed by the government. All the other things will flow from improving the numbers of building surveyors practicing in Victoria, and it needs to double at least. And until that's done, we will have people like Danny under extraordinary stress every day. And the other thing that adds a great deal of stress to the system is that we have a performance-based code. So the idea that we used to have a very prescriptive building regulation system. So when a building surveyor was giving advice about compliance, it was fairly straightforward. It was prescriptive. This complies, this doesn't. But in an environment of a performance-based code, it's very much based on creative decision-making. So any building surveyor providing compliance advice is not coming from the point of prescription. It's about an opinion, a personal opinion based on professional expertise. But there's a lot of variation in building surveyors' view of what compliance constitutes now. And whilst there's DTS in the code, there's an awful lot of regulation that isn't backed by DTS. Yeah. And that makes it far more risky for building surveyors to be giving advice about what constitutes compliance, yeah, when it is an area of that in many respects is a matter of opinion, yeah, personal professional opinion. So yeah, that has actually increased the workload for building surveyors substantially. When we had prescription, it was fairly straightforward. Now there's a lot more work involved in determining what compliance looks like.
Well, of course, you make a really good point, and that is there's not enough building surveyors for them to take two different roles in a project. I guess one of the answers to that would be that the design group is able to produce compliant design because of an increase in their knowledge in NCC compliance, and they don't need to have a building surveyor at the table. Now, that might seem unrealistic, but perhaps that's where we need to go. Could I get a comment from Bill or Anthony on that? And that will have to be our closing comment. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm sure. Happy to comment, Bill, or do you want to?
I was just going to mention, one of the improvements. I'll hand over to Anthony as well, but look, the level of compliance and documentation, it's all interrelated, as we said. So the Institute, for example, is about to publish a Code of Innovation, which is in response to the Building Confidence Report, talks to procurement in detail. And what we need is elements of the common language and the prescriptive nature in terms of what needs to be completed in order to then embark on looking at the permit side of things. That should be consistent across the board. So say, for example, within the code, if you actually had, this is the minimum level that one must reach. It's actually demonstrating through the industry that you must progress documentation to a point before you actually proceed. Yeah. Sorry, Anthony, I'll jump to you.
Another great recommendation from that little old report called the BCR. We don't have much more time. Anthony, did you want to make any other comment?
Look, just to reiterate what Bill was saying earlier, I think it's important for us to understand that under all scenarios, in the type of work I work with and the size of office I work in, we will require the engagement of a consultant building surveyor plus a separate relevant building surveyor across the project timeline. It's just that the complexity of navigating the multitude of compliance requirements and the risks they can pose to a project's viability without specialist compliance advice during the design phase are just too great.
Yeah. So some challenges there. We don't have any more time, but I am very grateful to the panel for the discussion and for being involved today. I think we've heard that perhaps the area of conflict of interest needs to be looked at a little more in terms of how the code might be improved and refined over time. And thank you again also to the audience for your participation through the polls in this panel discussion. And we'll now move on to the next presenter.